If an avoidant genuinely loves you, the first thing you won't experience is comfort. It's pressure, not because the connection is weak, but because it becomes real enough to activate every emotional defense they've spent years building. You will feel the attraction deepen. There's closeness, ease, and a sense that something meaningful is forming. Then, right when it feels like stability is finally within reach, they shift, they pull away, they become quieter, less available, harder to interpret. Most people assume that means the connection is ending, but that assumption misses the deeper layer of what is actually unfolding. In avoidant dynamics, love rarely moves in a straight line. It shows up in cycles, warmth followed by distance, openness followed by withdrawal. Without understanding this rhythm, what is actually fear gets mistaken for rejection, and what is actually emotional overwhelm gets mistaken for loss of interest. That's why the pattern matters so much. Because when there is a real emotional bond with an avoidant, something noticeable keeps happening. The connection doesn't fully disappear, it fades and returns, and every return is revealing something about the state of the bond, not just the behavior of the person. At the beginning of this kind of connection, there is usually an intensity that feels hard to explain. The emotional flow feels natural, almost effortless, as if the interaction bypasses the usual barriers people keep up. Conversations tend to go deeper than expected. Moments together feel more charged, more meaningful, even if nothing dramatic is happening on the surface. The avoidant senses this too. Even if they don't articulate it, they recognize that this is not a casual interaction. Being around you brings a strange combination of calm and exposure. They feel understood, yet also emotionally visible in a way that can feel unsettling. And that is where internal conflict begins. Because for someone with avoidant tendencies, emotional closeness can activate the same system that associates intimacy with loss of control. It is not necessarily fear of the other person. It is fear of what dependency, vulnerability, and emotional reliance might awaken inside them. So when the connection starts to deepen, their system reacts. They begin to create space. Their responsiveness changes. Their presence becomes inconsistent. One moment they are engaged, the next they feel distant. To the other person, this shift feels personal, even painful. But often the distance is not a sign of emotional absence. It is a sign of emotional overload. Most people respond to that withdrawal in the same predictable way. They try to close the gap. They reach out more, explain more, ask for clarity, and seek reassurance. From a human perspective, it makes complete sense. When something important feels like it's slipping away, the instinct is to hold on tighter. But in avoidant dynamics, this often creates the opposite effect. The more pressure they sense, the more they retreat. The more emotional intensity is directed at them, the more overwhelmed they become. What feels like effort to one person feels like suffocation to the other, and so the cycle strengthens itself. Pursuit increases distance, distance increases anxiety, and anxiety increases pursuit. The turning point begins when the response changes. Instead of reacting from fear, the focus shifts toward emotional steadiness. Instead of treating every withdrawal like a crisis, there is space to interpret it differently. The connection is no longer measured by immediate availability or constant reassurance, but by patterns over time. This doesn't mean becoming cold or detached. It means becoming grounded enough not to abandon yourself in the process of trying to hold someone else close. That shift alone changes the emotional tone of the entire dynamic. When that happens, something new becomes visible. The avoidant still steps back at times, but the experience of returning feels different. And that return is where the real information is. A return alone does not signal transformation. It only confirms that the bond still exists. What matters is what changes inside each cycle. In healthier movement, the distance begins to shorten. The emotional walls come down more quickly. Communication becomes slightly more open, slightly more consistent. The warmth doesn't disappear as abruptly as before. There may still be hesitation, but the extremes soften. Instead of disappearing completely, they pause and re-engage. Instead of shutting down fully, they begin to stay present for longer moments. These shifts may appear small, but in avoidant patterns, small changes are significant. Progress rarely arrives in dramatic breakthroughs. It shows up in gradual softening. However, if each return repeats the same emotional pain without any sign of awareness, responsibility, or change in behavior, then the cycle is simply looping. But when each return carries even a slight increase in honesty, presence, or emotional accessibility, something deeper is unfolding. The connection is not just repeating, it is evolving. Over time, this evolving dynamic begins to reshape how the avoidant experiences closeness itself. They slowly start to learn, through lived experience rather than logic, that intimacy does not automatically lead to loss of self. They begin to notice that emotional connection does not always result in pressure or entrapment. Space does not equal punishment. Closeness does not always equal control. These realizations are not sudden. They build gradually through repetition. They step back, and the relationship still exists. They return, and they are not met with chaos or emotional collapse. Instead, they encounter steadiness. This consistency becomes unfamiliar in a positive way. Their nervous system begins to register that closeness can be safe rather than threatening. As this pattern continues, internal resistance slowly loosens. Not in a dramatic transformation, but in subtle choices, staying longer in conversations, responding with more openness, allowing moments of discomfort instead of immediately escaping them. Each of these moments weakens the old fear response and strengthens emotional tolerance. Trust begins to form not because fear disappears, but because fear is no longer automatically obeyed. In the end, the real meaning of this dynamic is not found in one moment of closeness or one moment of distance. It is found in what repeats and what changes across time. A bond with an avoidant is defined less by intensity and more by evolution. If the cycle remains identical, distance, return, distance again with no deeper emotional movement, then nothing is shifting beneath the surface. But if each cycle brings even slight growth, more awareness, more stability, more willingness to remain emotionally present, then something meaningful is developing. The connection is learning how to exist without triggering complete withdrawal, and the people involved are learning how to stay connected without losing themselves. That balance is rare, and it is built slowly. Not through pressure, not through chasing, but through patterns that gradually teach both nervous systems a new way of relating. A clear sign that someone is still emotionally connected to you, even in silence, is their subtle willingness to let you see fragments of themselves they normally keep locked away. It is not obvious or dramatic. It shows up in small openings, brief honesty, or moments where their usual emotional distance softens just slightly. That is how trust actually begins to form in this kind of dynamic, not through grand gestures, but through quiet consistency that repeats over time. And if you are attentive enough, you start to notice the shift. Their absence doesn't feel as sharp as it once did. When they return, there is a slightly different quality to their presence. Less guarded, less defensive, more human. These changes are not loud, but they are meaningful. Subtle shifts are often the ones that signal the deepest internal movement, even if they are easy to overlook in the moment. At the same time, something equally important is happening within you. This connection does not only challenge the avoidant, it challenges you just as deeply. It forces you to examine whether you can remain open without losing yourself, whether you can care without becoming emotionally dependent, and whether you can stay connected without abandoning your own inner stability. At first, there is often a quiet hope that they will finally choose you in a way that makes everything feel secure. But as time passes, your understanding begins to shift. You start realizing that your emotional balance cannot depend on their changing moods, their availability, or their inconsistency. You stop measuring your worth based on how close or distant they are on any given day. You stop collapsing every time their energy shifts. Instead, you begin building something stronger within yourself, a steady internal foundation that does not rise and fall with the relationship. This does not mean your feelings disappear. It means they no longer control you. You remain caring, but no longer consumed. You stay connected, but no longer destabilized. Your emotional state becomes yours again. This is especially important because an avoidant cannot sustain closeness with someone who disappears into the relationship itself. When you abandon your boundaries, your identity, and your emotional center just to keep someone close, the connection becomes overwhelming for both sides. But when you remain grounded in who you are, the entire dynamic shifts. The relationship becomes lighter, more breathable, less like survival, more like choice. At that point, the narrative changes. It is no longer, "I need you to feel okay." It becomes, "I care about you, but I'm still complete on my own." That kind of emotional posture transforms the energy between two people, and often, this is where weaker bonds collapse under pressure, while stronger ones begin to reveal their real foundation. There is a difficult truth many people struggle to accept. You cannot build something stable with someone by rescuing them from their emotional patterns. And you also cannot create lasting connection by carrying the entire emotional weight alone. When one person constantly pursues and the other constantly withdraws, the relationship becomes imbalanced. One overextends while the other retreats further into protection. But when a connection is genuinely evolving, something different starts to emerge. Both people begin adjusting. The avoidant becomes slightly more aware of their withdrawal patterns. They may not change overnight, but they begin recognizing them. They become more honest about needing space instead of disappearing without explanation. They begin showing small signs of accountability for their emotional reactions. At the same time, you begin responding differently too. You stop interpreting every silence as rejection. You stop reacting from panic. You learn to distinguish between genuine intuition and emotional fear. You allow space without detaching emotionally. You stay present without trying to control the outcome. You remain open without losing yourself in uncertainty. This middle ground is where real change quietly begins. It is not intense or dramatic, but it is grounded in emotional maturity. And mature connection rarely looks like fantasy. It looks steady, gradual, and sometimes almost uneventful on the surface, even though everything underneath is shifting. If this resonates, then it is important to understand the next stage because it reveals whether the bond is simply repeating itself or slowly becoming something stable enough to hold. Eventually, a turning point arrives, and it does not come with a clear announcement. It is often almost invisible unless you are paying close attention. One day you realize they are not disappearing for as long. The emotional distance that once stretched for days now shortens. The walls that once felt impenetrable begin to show small openings. They start sharing more without being pushed. They reach out without needing a perfect reason. And most importantly, they begin to choose closeness rather than only tolerating it. That difference is essential. Tolerating closeness means staying near because the emotion is strong in the moment. Choosing closeness means beginning to trust it enough to remain present within it. That is when the dynamic starts to shift. It does not become effortless, and it is not free of uncertainty, but it becomes different in quality. You no longer feel like you are holding everything together alone. The effort becomes more mutual. The emotional weight is no longer carried by one side. You begin to feel their intention more clearly. Their consistency strengthens. Their presence becomes more meaningful. And over time you realize they are not just returning because of longing, they are returning with growing awareness of what the connection actually represents. In that realization lies an important truth. The relationship did not endure because it was easy. It endured because both people slowly changed enough to support it differently. This is what many people miss. Some connections are not meant to remain as they initially appear. They are meant to evolve the people inside them. And if that evolution is truly happening, it will show, not just in words, but in behavior, in consistency, in emotional responsibility, and in the growing ability to stay connected without turning closeness into fear. The real question goes deeper than the surface pattern. You have to ask what is actually changing inside the cycle itself. Is there genuine openness developing over time, or is one person simply becoming more comfortable receiving love without offering consistency in return? Are their returns bringing clarity, honesty, and accountability, or are they bringing more confusion, mixed signals, and emotional uncertainty? And just as importantly, what is happening within you through all of this? Are you becoming more grounded, more emotionally stable, and more aware of your own value? Or are you becoming more anxious, more drained, and increasingly disconnected from your inner self? These questions matter because the same relationship pattern can lead to very different outcomes depending on what it produces in both individuals. If the cycle is slowly building trust, improving communication, strengthening emotional awareness, and encouraging maturity on both sides, then something meaningful may truly be forming. But if the same cycle is only wearing you down, shrinking your emotional space, and teaching you to accept inconsistency as if it were love, then the lesson is no longer about patience. It may actually be about letting go. This is why intensity alone cannot be used as a measure of truth. Intensity is not progress. Chemistry is not safety. Longing is not commitment. Missing someone deeply is not the same as building a stable relationship with them. You have to look beyond how it feels in the moment and pay attention to where it is heading, because direction reveals what emotion often hides. Another important misunderstanding is the idea that an avoidant returning automatically means healing has occurred. It does not. A return does not erase fear, and it does not guarantee that the relationship is now on a straight path forward. There will still be moments of withdrawal, uncertainty, and emotional distance. What actually matters is how those moments are handled over time. When real growth is happening, setbacks no longer destroy progress. They become part of it. The avoidant may still need space, but they begin communicating it instead of disappearing. They may still feel overwhelmed, but they no longer punish the connection through silence. They still struggle with closeness, but they no longer treat intimacy itself as something dangerous. And on your side, your emotional experience also begins to change. You still feel hurt at times, but you recover more quickly. You begin to respond instead of react. You set clearer boundaries. You protect your emotional stability while remaining honest about your needs. This is what emotional maturity actually looks like in real life. It is not perfection. It is not constant harmony. It is two people gradually learning how not to let fear control every reaction. And that kind of progress is powerful precisely because it is earned through real situations, not imagined ideals. So, if you are in a connection like this, you need to observe carefully. One of the clearest signs of genuine love is not the absence of fear, but the ability for both people to experience fear without letting it dictate every decision they make. At the same time, you must understand the difference between patience and self-betrayal. This distinction is critical. Being patient with someone does not mean abandoning your standards. It does not mean accepting inconsistency as emotional depth. It does not mean waiting endlessly while receiving only enough attention to stay emotionally hooked. Real patience has structure. It is calm, but not passive. It is understanding, but not self-erasing. It sounds like, I can give you space, but I still need honesty. I can respect your process, but I will not beg for basic emotional clarity. I understand that healing takes time, but time alone is not enough without real effort. Many people lose themselves here. They confuse empathy with unlimited tolerance. They confuse compassion with self-neglect. They keep telling themselves that more time will fix everything, even when nothing in the actual pattern is changing. That is not patience anymore. It is emotional depletion. If the relationship is truly moving towards something stable, there will always be signs of movement. They may be small, but they will exist. More honesty, more accountability, more consistency, more emotional awareness than before. Progress in this kind of bond is rarely fast, but slow is not the same as stagnant. Slow still moves. Slow still builds. Slow still reveals intention through action. So stay compassionate, but stay alert. Stay open, but stay anchored in your own worth. Love should challenge you, but it should not erase you in the process. And if this is resonating deeply, there is another layer you need to understand, because sometimes the emotional intensity of this kind of relationship exists for a reason deeper than romance alone. These connections often act as mirrors. They push both people into growth they did not consciously choose but needed to confront. The avoidant is forced to face intimacy instead of escaping it. They are confronted with the patterns they've justified as independence but are actually rooted in fear. And you are also confronted with your own emotional patterns, your need for certainty, your fear of abandonment, and your tendency to chase stability from someone who cannot always provide it consistently. In that way, the connection becomes more than just a relationship. It becomes a reflection of unresolved emotional patterns on both sides. That is why it feels so intense. It activates deep internal material. It forces awareness. It disrupts old survival strategies. But here is what must be understood clearly. Growth alone does not guarantee permanence. Pain does not automatically make a bond meaningful in a lasting way. A relationship only becomes truly valuable when that growth leads somewhere healthier, toward more trust, more balance, and more emotional responsibility from both people. If both individuals are evolving, the bond strengthens over time. If only one person is evolving while the other remains stuck in avoidance, then the purpose of the connection may be personal growth rather than lifelong attachment. A relationship can change you deeply without being meant to stay forever. That distinction is crucial because one of the most common mistakes is assuming that transformation automatically means destiny. It does not. What matters is whether that transformation is bringing both people into greater emotional alignment or slowly pulling them apart. When the bond is genuinely becoming healthier, the emotional atmosphere begins to change. It feels less chaotic, less uncertain, less like an ongoing emotional emergency. The attraction is still there, the depth is still there, but there is also more peace within it, more clarity, more emotional space. You stop over-analyzing every silence. They stop feeling trapped by every emotional moment. There is more trust in distance, more stability in closeness, and more ease in communication. The relationship does not lose its emotion, it loses its panic. That is the shift many people wait for without being able to define it. The relationship starts to feel less like survival and more like choice. They choose to show up. You choose not to assume the worst. They choose to return with clarity instead of confusion. You choose to remain grounded instead of collapsing emotionally. And through enough of these repeated choices, the bond becomes stronger, not because it avoided difficulty, but because it learned how to move through difficulty without breaking. In the end, the truth of this kind of connection is not found in the intensity of the moments you share, nor in the confusion of the distance that follows. It is found in what remains consistent beneath all the cycles, what is actually growing, what is actually weakening, and what is being quietly shaped inside both of you over time. If the pattern is leading to more honesty, more emotional responsibility, more stability, and a gradual reduction in fear-driven behavior, then something real is being built, slowly, imperfectly, but meaningfully. But if the same cycle continues to drain your emotional energy, blur your sense of self, and keep you trapped in uncertainty without progress, then the connection is no longer teaching you love. It is teaching you endurance without direction. Real love does not only repeat itself, it evolves. It does not keep you guessing indefinitely, it becomes clearer with time. And it does not require you to lose yourself in order to keep it alive. So the final truth is simple. Do not measure this connection only by how strongly you feel it. Measure it by where it is taking you. Because the right kind of bond will not only pull you towards someone else, it will also bring you back home to yourself.